Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for December's financial check-in with FAME. I'm Mila Tappan. I'm the manager of college access and outreach at FAME, and I'll be your presenter today. And with me is Mary Dyer. So Mary is going to watch for questions and let me know if I need to stop or interject whenever is needed to add in some additional information. Today's presentation is being recorded and will be available on YouTube. All of our presentations we record and put on YouTube. And then early next week, I will send a follow-up email with the link, the slides, and additional resources. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. Today's topic is getting the most for your money, financial aid, and the return on investment of higher education. This is part one, and part two will be in March. You can go ahead and register for that anytime by going to famemaine.com/events. So what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about the financial aid process, the steps to get ready, things people can start doing sooner rather than later. We're going to talk just a little about the FAFSA itself. We're going to emphasize the importance of saving and talk about how savings impacts or really doesn't tend to impact financial aid eligibility. Then we'll talk about what happens after the FAFSA is submitted. In reality, a lot of what happens related to financial aid happens after that. So we will talk about things like how do schools determine eligibility, what financial aid offers look like. We'll share some tools to compare those financial aid offers. And then we're going to talk about return on investment because I think more than ever, that's a topic of conversation. Is it worth it? And we're going to talk about some ways to kind of think about that. And then we'll end by talking about some strategies just to make higher ed more affordable. Just kind of a big picture, couple of thoughts that we've experienced as ourselves as going through this. Both Mary and I have kids that have gone through college. She still has one in college. So we'll share some thoughts about things we've learned that we hope are applicable to everyone's experiences. So let's start by talking about what financial aid is. So financial aid is any type of aid that's available to help people pay for higher education. And we'll break down some of the specific types of aid in just a moment. But I want to start by talking about the fact that there are two broad categories of financial aid. There's merit-based aid, which is aid that is based on who the student is and what they bring to the table. So for example, students who are really strong academically might find that some schools, through their admissions office, might offer them a scholarship. So they say, not only do we want you to come here, but we're going to give you some scholarship money to make it more affordable for you. Athletic money is a type of merit aid based on the student's athletic abilities having nothing to do with their family's financial situation. And then sometimes individual departments or at colleges might have money available because they are trying to attract a certain type of student with certain talents or characteristics. Merit-based aid is those sorts of funds that are given to a student, again, based on their characteristics, not having anything to do with their financial situation and that of their families. Today's presentation, we're going to really focus on the other type of aid, which is need-based aid, but I always want to be sure people are aware of merit-based aid because it is one of those types of aid that people really need to talk to the individual schools to find out what they have available and how to apply for it. Not every school offers merit-based aid, but a lot of schools do. So that's an important thing for families to be thinking about as they're researching schools and to be sure that they do ask the schools, do you have merit aid? And if so, how can we apply for that? Our focus today is going to be on this need-based aid. And need-based aid is aid that is awarded to a student based on their family's financial situation. So it's going to look at the student's financial situation and the family's financial situation. And how schools determine how much need an individual student has is all schools require that students file the FAFSA, the Free Application for Federal Student Aid, and all schools use the FAFSA to determine eligibility for federal financial aid. And here in Maine, we also use it to determine eligibility for the Maine State Grant. So it's in filing this form that colleges can get a sense of how much need an individual student has. And I'm going to show you in a little bit how schools actually do that. We want to be sure that everybody files the FAFSA. That's a message that we're going to share in virtually every presentation that we talk about, because even if people don't think they'll qualify, the FAFSA has been revised as of last year. Many more people are eligible for federal aid than were in the past. And additionally, what you're going to find is that many scholarships require that students file the FAFSA in order to be considered for that. And additionally, if students are going to borrow any money at all, federal student loans are best. And we want to be sure that students are able to access those. And in order to do that, they do have to file the FAFSA. And then last but not least, I'm sure many of you are familiar with free community college. Currently, that's available through the class of 2025. We'll see what happens going forward. But in order to be considered for free community college or to receive free tuition and fees, students do have to file the FAFSA. So we always want to spread that word that everyone out there who's even contemplating higher education should file the FAFSA. Now, what I'd like to focus on, and I know that from looking at the attendees list, I have a variety of types of, attendees. I think I have some coworkers or some professionals, partners that we work with, and some of you might just be parents who have received our information and are joining us as a parent. So I'm going to kind of speak more to you. So I'm going to do this presentation in terms of the fact that I'm speaking to parents out there, but know that I do recognize that I've got some coworkers and some professional colleagues on this as well. So one of the things that we'd love to have families do is to start researching colleges, including financial aid, sooner rather than later. What that is probably one of the most important steps in this process. Sometimes what happens is students get their heart set on a particular school that right from the outset, we might know that that school is going to be very expensive and unaffordable to that family. So the idea of students applying to and having a list of, maybe 4 to 6 schools at least that are going to be a good fit for them in all sorts of ways is really important so that at the end of the day, students have a variety of choices available to them. I think it was last spring, I had a student who had only applied to 2 out-of-state schools, neither of which had good financial aid at all. And so she had really no great choices. And that's a situation that we want to avoid. So starting this process of researching schools early is great. Now, one of the things we want people to be aware of is that we don't want you to focus on the sticker price, though, because the sticker price is not what most people pay, especially here in Maine. Instead, we want to focus on the net price. So what the net price is the cost of that school after grants and scholarships, which are funds that don't have to be repaid. So we want that to be the focus because that's what really matters to a family is what's the school going to cost you specifically. Now, schools do have a net price calculator. They're required to have that on their website. So you can go to a school's website, you can put in your financial information. The school will use their information in terms of what they have available for resources, and they will put together an estimated financial aid offer. So I think that's a great thing for families to do. I would be cautious in that it is truly just an estimate. We find some estimates are better than others. Some schools do a really good job of getting pretty close. Others are a little out of the ballpark, but it is a really good place to start just to get a sense of how much a school might cost you after financial aid. But another thing that I think is super important to do is to research schools to find those schools that have good financial aid available, generally speaking. So, this is all about averages, and we know that sometimes, averages don't end up playing out in our favor, but it's a really good idea to use the College Board's Big Future site, because what this site can do, and I'm going to show you it in just a second, what this site can do is give you a sense of whether a school does a pretty good job meeting that need that a student has. Some are able to meet virtually all the need, but most can't. And so this tool can help you figure that out. So here is a screenshot of the College Board's Big Future site. And what you're going to see here is that you can search for schools based on a whole variety of criteria. So in this database, there are about 4,000 schools. So that's an overwhelming number. But in reality, what you're wanting to do is to filter that down to the schools that meet your students' needs. So most of the time, what we're going to be doing is looking at major, because most students have a certain major or a group of majors that they're interested in. So we can filter based on that. We can filter based on location. Maybe they want to stay in Maine. Maybe they want to get out of Maine. The size of the school, I think, is another really important thing. Some students are going to do really well at a large school. They want to, just go meet all sorts of new people. Other students find that they're going to do better if they're at a smaller school where faces are always going to be familiar. So that criteria can be used. But then there's another piece of criteria that I want to be sure that everyone uses when researching schools, and that's the affordability criteria. So when an individual selects the affordability criteria, what you're going to be able to do is filter through those 4,000 schools and find schools that not only meet your criteria for location, major, size, or whatever other things are important to you, but also are taking a look at how good a job these colleges do to fill the financial need that a student does have. So you can see here that I could start by selecting schools that meet 100% of need. That's the ideal situation. I'm going to be perfectly honest. There aren't a tremendous number of schools that do that. And those that do are usually really hard to get into. But some students, that is going to be a possibility. When I was working with my kids, I said, let's start by looking at schools that meet at least 90% of need. So once a school is identified, and it's determined how much need that student has at that school, that at least on average, the school's meeting 90% of that, which is pretty good, okay? We'd prefer 100%, but 90% is pretty good. So this is one thing that I really wish everyone would do. I'm not saying that I think people should always select the least expensive school. I think it's important to find a school that's a good fit academically, location-wise, and all of those other factors are super important. But the families that I meet, and I know for ourselves, affordability was a huge piece of that. And I think you're here because affordability is important. So building this in is something I really hope that everyone will do. Some other things that I would like families to be thinking about as they're going through this process is to research required deadlines and forms. So deadlines, as we know, can be things that are sometimes super important and sometimes they're just to keep us on track. When it comes to the admissions and financial aid process, deadlines are incredibly important. For a matter of fact, those schools that don't have all of the money that they wish that they had, because every school would like to meet 100% of need, but schools that don't have as much money as they wish, what they do in some cases, they'll have a priority filing deadline. So students who meet that deadline get considered for all of the types of aid that are available. Those who miss that deadline will still get considered for aid, but only for what's left. So that's one of the most important ways to maximize financial aid eligibility, is to be sure that you're aware of deadlines and you meet them. And they do vary by school. So using some sort of a document to keep you on track is going to be very helpful. The other thing that we want families to do as they're researching schools and going to the individual schools' websites, which is where they're going to find those deadlines, is to see what financial aid applications are required. So the FAFSA is a given for all schools. All schools have to use the FAFSA to determine eligibility for federal financial aid, and that's what's used here in Maine to determine eligibility for the Maine State Grant. Most schools also use the FAFSA to determine eligibility for their own institutional money. But there are some schools that use a supplemental form that they can use only to determine eligibility for their own institutional money. Here in Maine, the only 3 schools that require anything beyond the FAFSA are Bates, Bowdoin, and Colby. So if students are looking to go to school here in Maine and they are not applying to Bates, Bowdoin, and Colby, the FAFSA is it. But if Bates, Bowdoin, and Colby are on their list, they need to do the profile in addition to the FAFSA. And we find that many schools in the Boston area also require the CSS profile. So it's really important to go to each school's website, figure out deadlines, figure out forms. FAFSA is a given, but see if any other forms are required. Another thing that's really good to be thinking about as soon as possible is to save as much as is possible to pay for higher education. It's never too late to get started. So even if we have families that are here, who have juniors and seniors in high school, it's still not too late. But there's no doubt that the earlier that you start, the better. And we're going to talk in a moment about savings, because I think a lot of people believe, we've heard this for years and years, that saving is a negative when it comes to financial aid eligibility, and that's just not the reality. But I'm going to share some specifics as to why that is not the case. So saving as much as possible is a really, really good thing. Another thing to be doing is to search for outside scholarships. So let's just say the student finds a school and they love that school. You do your research, you find that they're not a school that does a great job in terms of financial aid. Well, maybe the student can bring their own money with them in the sense that they apply for outside scholarships from other sources, and they can take those scholarships with them to that specific school. That's one way of making maybe less affordable schools more affordable. So we want students to research and apply for outside scholarships. They can start by going to our website, famemaine.com/scholarships. We do have a variety of scholarships on our website. We also have links to other scholarships and other scholarship organizations. We have a tracking sheet, so we'd love people to start there. One scholarship that I'm not going to go into details on, though, is the Worthington Foundation Scholarship. Worthington Scholarship Foundation, excuse me. This scholarship is absolutely amazing and is available to students who graduate from a Maine public high school who are attending college here in Maine. So I'd like everyone to take a look at this, to visit this website, because their goal is to give 1,000 scholarships per year to these students. So we're finding a tremendous number of students are going to be eligible for that scholarship here in Maine. So please check that out. And then the last thing I want to talk about in terms of kind of getting ready for this process, going through the financial aid process, is to create a studentaid.gov account. And when people create their studentaid.gov account, they set up a username and password, which gets referred to as an FSA ID. We're trying to transition away from using the term FSA ID because the federal student aid is going to be transitioning away from it. So what we're talking about is that people need to go to studentaid.gov and just set up an account, okay? That username and password is what they will use to access studentaid.gov. And what's on the studentaid.gov site now is everything federal student aid related. So it used to be that there was a place for loans, there was a place for the FAFSA. Now that is all under the studentaid.gov umbrella. But to get to the FAFSA and to be able to sign any documents, whether it be the FAFSA or anything loan related, people need to be able to sign in with this username and password that they create. So we want people to go to studentaid.gov. People can do this anytime and get this set up, but you absolutely have to do it before the FAFSA gets filed. Every single student needs to create a studentaid.gov account. And if students need to have parent information on the FAFSA, at least one parent will need to do that as well. Now, just a couple things about the studentaid.gov account. It is tied to an individual social security number. So when students create their account, we want to be sure that they enter the accurate information. But the other thing that's important to just kind of keep in mind is because it's tied to our social, and because we only have one social security number, we will only ever have one studentaid.gov account. So I have an account. I use that same account. I use that same username and password to log in, whether I'm going to do a FAFSA myself, which I do every year just to go through the process. So I do a FAFSA pretending I'm a student. I use that same account to log into, whether I'm doing that as a student or when I was doing the FAFSA and having to provide parent information. So for parents out there who might be repaying their own federal student loans, you might already have this account set up. If you have an older child, once you set it up for your older child, you're going to use that same information for your younger child. Okay, so when the time comes, you want to be sure that those accounts get created. But again, they can be created anytime, but they have to be created before the student can file their FAFSA. So we've kind of talked about what we want families to be thinking about in terms of getting ready to file the FAFSA and how to navigate this process. But then when the time comes, they will actually go again to studentaid.gov and complete the FAFSA. I'm not going to do a deep dive into the FAFSA today. I just want to share a couple of highlights about the FAFSA. Normally, the FAFSA becomes available on October 1st of each year. This year and last year, it was delayed for a variety of reasons, but it will be back on track next year for an October 1st opening. So every year, the FAFSA should, from this point forward, become available on October 1st. The FAFSA did get a major overhaul last year and is working very well this year, thankfully. And last year, when they did the overhaul, they made it a roles-based form. And what I mean by that is there's a student section to the FAFSA and a parent section to the FAFSA. Students complete their section and parents complete their section, and they don't see each other's information. So it does require that the student log into their section with their username and password into their studentaid.gov account, and parents will do the same. we are finding with this new FAFSA that the student section takes less than 15 minutes and the parent section takes less than 15 minutes. So that all totaled, it's usually less than a half an hour to get the FAFSA completely done and submitted. So that's really, really good news. One of the reasons that the FAFSA is so much easier than it used to be is that federal tax information is automatically transferred into the FAFSA once consent is provided. So everybody has to provide consent. That's a requirement of getting federal financial aid. But one of the real benefits of this is that that tax information is going to come over automatically into the FAFSA. You actually can't see it, but it lives there behind the scenes. And that is going to populate the vast majority of questions in the financial section. So that has just made filing the FAFSA super easy. And on top of that, it means that that information is correct, meaning that schools can rely on that information and don't have to verify or ask students to provide them with additional information. Now, the FAFSA does have to be filed every single year. So unlike the admissions process where the student they apply for admission, they go to a school, they love that school. They don't reapply for admission every year. They do have to reapply for financial aid every single year. So we always want to mention that so that people have that on their radar. At the end, I'm going to talk about how people can sign up to get texts and emails from us. We'd love to have people do that because what we do is this time of year, we send a reminder and let people know that, don't forget, you've got to file for financial aid every single year. I do want to talk a little bit about when completing the FAFSA, how savings and how assets work, because we get a lot of questions about this, and there is still this belief that saving is going to have a negative impact on financial aid eligibility. And what I want everyone to know is that the FAFSA formula is income driven, not asset driven. So savings has little to no impact on financial aid eligibility. And people might say, well, why? I've heard this, right? Throughout the years, I've heard people say, well, so-and-so saved. And because they saved, they didn't get as much financial aid. And what I want families to know is that people who didn't get as much financial aid and who did save, it wasn't because they saved. They were not going to get any more financial aid, even if they hadn't saved. But because they'd saved, they now have additional options available to them. So that's one of the biggest messages I want to convey today. So why is that? Why do assets have such little impact on the FAFSA? Well, one is that many families don't have to provide any asset information at all. And obviously, if you don't provide any assets, you're not going to be impacted by that. So the way the FAFSA is currently, that those families earning less than $60,000 per year, typically depending on the tax schedules that they file, do not have to provide any asset information at all. They don't even see those questions, which again makes the FAFSA easier. Those who are receiving any means tested benefits also do not have to provide any asset information at all. That's everything from an earned income tax credit to TANF, WIC, main care. So any families who have any member of their family who receives one of those benefits, they are automatically not required to provide any asset information and won't even see those questions on the FAFSA. So we have a whole slew of people who never even see asset questions, so therefore are not impacted by assets. For those individual families that do have to provide assets, then what they're going to find is that their most significant assets in many cases are excluded from the FAFSA. So when filling out the FAFSA, there are 3 asset questions: cash savings checking, investments, and then farm and business. What you want to exclude when you're filling out the FAFSA, though, is the primary residence. So you never will include the primary residence as an asset on the FAFSA. So for many people, that might be their largest asset, and that is always excluded from the FAFSA. Additionally, retirement accounts, the value of those accounts are excluded from the FAFSA. So individuals are never going to provide anything that's in an officially designated retirement account. And additionally, personal possessions are excluded. So if people, have their cars or their four-wheelers or their boats or anything like that, that's all excluded from the FAFSA. So I think most of us, if we look around, Those are our most significant assets. Now, if people do have to provide assets, the things that they're going to provide are things like their cash, savings, checking on the day that they file. If they have a second property, they will need to list the net worth of that, the value after any debt against it. Non-retirement investments, including college savings plans, do have to be listed if assets are required. And again, farm and business net worth would be required as well for those families that have to provide assets. Now, I just want to mention, because this is a slight change as of last year, that if people do have a 529, which is a college savings plan, NextGen is the one here in Maine, that is listed as a parent asset. And you would only include the amount for that student. So if I were doing the FAFSA today and I have 2 kiddos and they each have an account, I'm only going to list the value for the student whose FAFSA I'm completing. So that's a good thing. That's a change from the past that's very welcomed. Now, when we talk about assets, student assets do have more impact than parent assets. So if we've got a family that's a higher earner family, they're going to have to provide assets based on the requirements. Then thinking about saving things in a way that they're in the parent's name, like in a 529, can be beneficial rather than having it count in the student's name. If you have any questions about any of this, you can drop them in the chat or put them in the Q&A, and I will stop and answer any questions, or you can always follow up with me afterwards. So we've talked about things to get ready. As we talk about the financial aid process, we've talked about actually going ahead and filing the FAFSA, and then what happens afterwards. So once the parent and student sections have been completed and signed, the FAFSA can be submitted. FAFSA is processed within 1 to 3 days. Students are sent an email once it's processed. I think one thing I'd want parents to know is that the communications are with the student, not the parent. So when you think about the admissions process, that's not surprising. We know the student is the one who's notified that they've been offered admission. It works the same way with financial aid. So even though parents are more involved in the financial aid process, it is the student that is going to be the one that they primarily communicate. Being the federal government is primarily going to communicate with the student, as is the college. Okay. So students will be notified once their FAFSA has been processed. They will have the ability to review their FAFSA information. It's called the FAFSA submission summary. And they can go in and they can correct any errors. They can list any additional schools. I want to make that point because I think sometimes people get really anxious when they fill out the FAFSA. I want people to know that if you do make a mistake, you can fix it. So to try to take a deep breath and know that, okay, even if I do make a mistake, I've done it. We can go back in and we can fix it. Okay. When people fill out the FAFSA and it gets submitted and it gets processed, it generates something called a student aid index, or an SAI. In the past, that was the expected family contribution, or the EFC. And last year that was replaced and renamed to be the SAI, or the student aid index. This is what schools use to determine eligibility for financial aid, for need-based financial aid. So they take all of the information on the FAFSA, and to some extent, they boil it down to this one number, and this one number is significant in terms of determining financial aid eligibility. I'll show you exactly how that works in just a moment. Where that information can be found is on that FAFSA submission summary. So I know this is a little bit, the type is small here, but on the FAFSA submission summary, which again, the student can see if they log into studentaid.gov with their username and password, down here is where it's going to give them their student aid index. Okay, so if anyone ever wonders where that lives, that's where you can find it. Once the FAFSA is processed, the data is going to be sent to all of the schools that are listed on the FAFSA. So in the student section, the student can list up to 20 schools that they want to receive this information. And then from that point on, students are going to work with the schools to discuss any updates to the FAFSA, to discuss any appeals, any changes in circumstances. That's where they're going to get their financial aid offers. So up to this point, we've been really working with studentaid.gov on that website. But once the FAFSA has been submitted and processed, then the communications are going to be directly with the individual schools that the students have applied to. Now, Mary, I saw that a question came up. I haven't looked at it. Is it something that we need to talk about?
I think it maybe makes sense because you just spoke of it, Mila. The question was, do 529 accounts go under the section for cash savings and checking, or under investments, including real estate? So where you just covered it, why
Yeah.
not?
Yeah, I can add that, sure. It goes under investments is where that would go. But I want people to know that whether it's in the cash savings checking, the investments, they all get counted the same way. They get totaled up and they are looked at as being equivalent assets regardless of what type of asset they are. But it does go on that second line. Okay. All right. So I just wanted to, as we kind of move through the FAFSA filing process, I wanted to share a couple of resources with you, and I want you to know that these will be in the email that I send you as a follow-up next week. Our pay publication is our primary financial aid publication. It provides an overview of this entire process. As I've been going through this presentation, you might have noticed down at the bottom, it refers to more information on that particular topic on a certain page of pay. So pay will be coming your way digitally. And so you can reference that and you can find out more about some of the topics that I've talked about today. The other document I want you to be aware of, and of course we update this every year because I'm guessing that some of you might have kids that are not ready to go through this process yet. We always put together a get ready to file the FAFSA document. And this document is meant to be, it's a one-pager back and front. It's really meant to be the resource that you need to get ready. So it talks about what steps to take to get ready, but it also includes things like assets. What assets count? What assets don't count? On the back, we provide information as to when parent information is required. So for most high school seniors, they do have to provide parent information on the FAFSA, but not always. And even if they need to senior year, parents sometimes wonder, when do we no longer have to do this? So on the back of that document, we list all of the federal criteria so that once a student can answer yes to any one of those pieces of criteria or those questions, that's when parent information is no longer required. And then we do have, if parent information is required, who is the parent, specifically in divorce, separated situations like that. So these resources will be coming your way, and you can use them to answer some of those sorts of questions and know that this gets updated every year, and this document and pay are available on our website as well. All right, now, so we filed the FAFSA and it's been processed. So the next step is to then have the schools get the data. So the schools will have received all of the FAFSA data, including that SAI, of that student aid index. And what schools are going to do with that is they're going to determine the individual student's financial need. How schools determine need is the same for all schools. So what all schools are going to do is they're going to use the following formula. They're going to say, we're going to take the cost of attendance, which includes direct and indirect expenses. So at a school, when they're building their cost of attendance, because every school has an official cost of attendance, that's going to include tuition, fees, housing, whether on campus or off, food, again, on campus or off. It's going to take into account things like books, supplies, travel expenses, and other miscellaneous expenses. So each school is going to have a cost of attendance that consists at least of all of those components. Now, one school's cost of attendance might be $12,000. Our community colleges are much less expensive. I have seen cost of attendance numbers for some private schools pushing $80,000 to $90,000 at this point. Okay, so cost of attendance can be quite low, would be super high. Then what the school does is once they've determined their cost of attendance, they subtract out that student's SAI, that student aid index that's a result of filing the FAFSA. Let's just say that for the case of the scenario today, that my student has an SAI of 8,000, okay? And then they're going to determine how much need that results in. So let's just say we're at a school that's $25,000 a year. I got to do the math in my head here. $25,000 a year. The student's SAI is 8,000. That means, right, 17,000. Am I right? 17? 17. Yes, $17,000 in need. Okay. Conversely, though, and this is why we always want people to file, even if they think that they are going to be, they're not going to have as much need. If they're at that school that's 80,000, and that school says, okay, our cost of attendance is 80,000, subtract out that SAI, it's still going to be 8,000. They have $72,000 in need. So that's again why we want everyone to go through this process and why the financial aid offer from one school might be dramatically different than at another school because the cost of attendance is going to vary by school. So therefore, the amount of need that an individual student has is going to vary by school. Their student aid index is going to be the same unless they do an appeal, but student aid index typically is going to stay the same, but their need will vary because the costs vary. Those schools that use a supplemental application like the CSS profile will do basically the same thing. They will just use the output from that supplemental form to determine eligibility for their own institutional money. Okay, Mary, did I see another question come in?
Yes, but I answered it, although it
Okay.
may be beneficial for the entire group. The question was when reporting next gen on the FAFSA, do you include the matching grants that have been awarded? So I did answer that yes, you include the matching grants, any earnings, basically the value of the account at the time that you're completing the FAFSA, but feel free to add anything to that if there is anything.
I don't think there's anything because you answered it absolutely correctly. So yes, the full value of the account, which obviously changes from day to day potentially. So you're just going to, the way assets work is you provide the value as of the day you're filing the FAFSA. Okay. So I'm not going to go knee deep into the different types of aid that are available, but once the school gets the FAFSA data, they figured out their cost of attendance, they figured out their award parameters, as we used to call it. Mary and I used to work at UMaine together, and we had our award parameters. And that's how we would, we take that information and then we put together a financial aid offer. And financial aid offers are going to vary by student and by school. But some very broad categories of financial aid are grants and scholarships. Those are the best types of financial aid. Those funds are funds that do not have to be repaid. Scholarships usually have some sort of a merit component, and grants usually are strictly based on financial need. A little bit of gray there sometimes, though, too. At the end of the day, though, these are the best types of aid because they do not have to be repaid. So these funds might come from the federal government in terms of like the federal Pell Grant. They might come from the state of Maine in the form of the Maine State Grant, and all students have to do to apply for a Maine State Grant is to file their FAFSA by the spring, by May 1st of their senior year or whatever year they're in. So as long as they do that, they're automatically going to be considered for the Maine State Grant. Institutions, again, might have their own money. Some of those really high cost schools might have a tremendous amount of scholarship and grant money available. And then those private sources like the Worthington Scholarship or the Mitchell Scholarship. So all of those are great, fall into that category of the best types of aid possible. Then there's something called work study, which is basically where a student gets, we'll see a lump sum awarded on their financial aid offer, and they will earn that money. So once they get to school, they will get a job on campus. There is an office that can help them do that, and they will work a certain number of hours and get a certain rate of pay that's worked out between them and their employer. And that money can be used for their incidental expenses. It can be used for their gas money home. It can be their laundry money or their pizza money. Some students are really great about saving their fall work study money and using it to buy their spring books. What work study is not helpful for, because we get this question every summer, is it can't be used to pay that first semester bill. Okay, so because the work study is not available till the student gets to campus and starts earning it, it's just better for those other incidental expenses. It's not available that first semester. Throws people off every year. Some schools, financial aid offers make that very clear, and others it's a little murky still. And then there are federal student loans. I would anticipate that the vast majority of students are going to see a direct student loan offered on their financial aid offer. First year students are eligible for $5,500, which might be all unsubsidized or a mix of subsidized and unsubsidized, but the total being $5,500. So students can borrow loans all on their own. The benefit of a federal student loan is that a student is eligible for it without a cosigner. It is not a credit-based loan, so no cosigner required. Students are eligible for a federal student loan simply because they filed a FAFSA and they are a matriculated or degree-seeking student at an eligible institution. That's the criteria. But on the flip side of that, there is a limit to that. $5,500 is the maximum for a first-year student, $6,500 for a second-year student, and $7,500 for upper class undergrads. So it's not a case where students can borrow everything they want. There are limits to that, but again, they can get those loans with no cosigner. So those are the types of aid that you would see on many financial aid offers. Again, they're going to vary by school. So one student let's say they've applied to 6 schools, will get 6 different financial aid offers. They're all going to look different. There are some types of aid that might be similar from one school to the next, like a Pell Grant or like their federal student loans. Other types of aid might be very different from one school to the next. So one of the key things that families need to do is find a way to compare all of these offers and get an understanding of how affordable one school is versus the next. And this might seem like this is really simple, but it's a little bit harder than you might think because every financial aid offer looks different. And some schools are really great about doing the math for you, and they show you the cost, they show you what it's going to cost after the grants and scholarships, and then after the loans. Other schools, there's no cost information at all, even on the financial aid offer. So we've put together a form that we'd love to have people use, which is where students and parents together, ideally doing this together, can go and look at their financial aid offers and find the related cost information. And they would enter first for the first school, school A, the tuition fees and the housing expenses. Okay. So they're going to, let's assume many first year students are living on campus. So their dorm and their meal plan. So those are what we call their direct expenses. That's what they're going to get billed by the school. Those are the expenses that they have no control over. So they're going to do that for school A. So they're going to say, okay, tuition fees, I'm going to call it room and board, but housing and on-campus meals. And then they're going to subtract out grants and scholarships, the funds that don't have to be repaid. That's what that's what it actually is going to cost to go to that school roughly. Okay. So do that for school A, do that for school B, do that for school C. And then you get that apples to apples comparison, because what we can see happen is sometimes the most expensive school actually can be more affordable than a lower cost school, because it all comes down to what do they offer in the way of grants and scholarships. So if a higher cost school offers more grants and scholarships, then they actually might be more affordable than a lower cost school that maybe is not able to offer as much in the way of grants and scholarships. So walking through this process is absolutely critical. I have several desires in life, and one of them is that before anyone commits to a school, they go through this worksheet and they have an understanding of what the school is actually going to cost them. Sometimes we will have people, paying their deposit or accepting their offer of admission even before they've seen a financial aid offer. And we just think that, this is a huge financial commitment in many cases, deciding which school to attend. So being an informed consumer is as important when you're making a college decision as it is when you're buying a car or something similar. So going through this is really important. And of course, we can help with this. So this is something that we can meet with families on and work with you to figure all of this out. And so I just have a few more thoughts before we end today. And one is I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about return on investment. This is something that is increasingly important for us to be talking about and sharing information with you on, because I think people are really starting to say, is it worth it? Is going to college worth it? Is spending this money worth it? And so to step back from that and say, what is the return on investment is incredibly important. Now, there are lots of parts of this return on investment conversation that I'm not going to touch on today. But what I do want to focus on is, what is the cost of attending a school? Are people borrowing loans? And are those loans worth it in the sense of, are they getting that return on investment by borrowing X number of dollars, thinking about what their career choices are? So what we want to step back and think about, and I'm going to tell you, I didn't used to do this. So when I worked in the financial aid office all those years ago, I might have known what major a student was, and maybe I would have a little bit of a different conversation based on what the student was pursuing. But nowadays, this is front and center to be talking about this. So we want to think about the job ideas that the student has, the career that they think they want to pursue. First of all, are there going to be job openings? We know that there are some areas where there's going to be tremendous number of job openings. There's going to be others where that's going to be a little bit tougher to get that job. What do the earnings look like? What are the other benefits of working in a particular career field or not? So one of the best places, I think, to start this research and to learn more about these careers is to go to Career One Stop. So here's a picture of their website. And so the link is in the presentation, but otherwise you can just go to Career One Stop and it will come right up at the top of your searches, or it should. So one of the things that you can do when you go to Career One Stop is you can do all sorts of research, but for the moment, I just want to focus in on salaries. So let's start by talking about two students. And one is going to be a nurse, wants to pursue nursing, and the other wants to be a high school teacher. Okay. There are lots of students wanting to do both of those things. So I can research salaries using Career One Stop, and I can research salaries nationally. I can research salaries based on state, like here in Maine. I can even research salaries based on city. So I didn't do that. I just did nationally and state. But for example, I could go and look at the difference, and I have in the past, between, I live in Bangor, so I can look at Bangor versus Portland. So you can get that granular when you're looking at this data. So what I did here is I said, okay, for a registered nurse in Maine, what do salaries look like? Now, we're talking about students who are going to be, graduating and moving into a job. So I'm thinking more about starting salaries. So let's look at the low end. Okay, so maybe over time they can earn these really higher salaries, but when they get out, they're probably not going to be in the high category. So let's look at the low side of things. So here in Maine, the average salary that I'm going to be using, the average low, so let's say starting salary is 64,600. Okay, good salary, right? People I think out of school would be pretty happy to have that be their salary to get started. Then let's look at a high school teacher. So as we know, teachers don't earn as much money as some other professions. And so when we look at that, that's in the neighborhood of 45, almost $46,000. Okay. So we could do this with any career out there. We could go and we could research that. And I think this is really important to do because I think that students, 16, 17-year-olds don't always know what jobs pay. So it's a really good reality check both for students and for parents. But here is where I'd like people to take another step. So once you have determined that, we have this really cool tool on our website. So this is our student loan salary calculator. And what this can help people do is to figure out how much debt is reasonable based on what their income is going to be. Because here's the thing, people who earn more money can afford to take on more debt. People who aren't going to be earning as much money need to keep their debt even lower. I mean, we'd all love to be in a world where no debt was what we're talking about, but just being realistic, that is not the reality for most of the families that we're working with. Okay. So what I was able to do with our calculator is I had the interest rate at 6.5%. That's about where federal student loans are right now. Said repayment of 10 years, which is the standard term. And I said, if my salary is $64,600, it tells me that I probably shouldn't borrow more than about 37, 38,000. Okay. Now, these are those rules of thumb. There are situations where people are going to live in high cost areas or low cost areas, and that amount might be different. But this is just on average, people who are earning, almost $65,000 a year can find that they can reasonably repay about $38,000 in student loan debt without being in a situation where they can't do anything else, financially. Okay. Now, compare that to our high school teacher. So our high school teacher, as we talked about, had a salary more around 45, 46,000. They should, using this calculator, really try to keep their debt lower, more in the neighborhood of 26 or 27,000 in order for it to be comfortable for them to repay their debt and to still have, maybe a home down the road and cars and all of those things that people need. Okay. So I'm going to be honest, I wasn't always thinking about it through these terms years ago, right? That my nurses, I needed to have this conversation. Okay, this is maybe what you can borrow. But my high school teachers, that amount is going to need to be, less if we want it to be possible for them to be financially comfortable after schools. But here's the thing, schools do not award financial aid based on major. Maybe we will get to that point someday, but for now, that's not what's happening. So that's why it's incumbent on the student and the parents to do this research to try to make sure that what they are borrowing is in line with what their salary is going to be. Because what we don't want to have happen is a situation where students borrow far more than they can afford. And then when they graduate, be like, oh my gosh, why did I go to school? It wasn't worth it. No, going to school is not what wasn't worth it. Borrowing as much as you did to go to that particular school is where the concern comes in. This all comes way back to the beginning of the presentation as to why we want the student to have a variety of schools on their list so that they don't have just one or two choices when their financial aid offers come in, but instead they have a variety of good choices available. We want to avoid this mismatch. So it is very common when we're working with students and families to have them borrow $20,000 per year. That doesn't always seem all that concerning sometimes, which is concerning to me. So $20,000 per year, which means they're not only borrowing their federal loans, but they're tapping into some outside sources of loans as well. But $20,000 per year over 4 years is going to be $80,000. One of the cool things about this calculator is it will do it the other way too. So I can put in my debt. So if I'm a student and I'm saying, okay, if I go to this school, I need to borrow 20,000 a year. What is that over 4 years? It's 80,000. And it tells me how much I theoretically need to comfortably pay that off. So what is my needed salary to pay that off? And in the case of $80,000, it's about $136,000. Now, here's what's concerning. I don't know hardly any students coming out of college who are earning $136,000. I know a lot of students who are borrowing 80,000. So we need to break this, right? We need to be sure that students are keeping those two things in sync with each other. And there are so many great options available. There are so many schools out there. And if we can have students remain flexible as to where they're going, there are many choices so that they don't end up in this situation where there is this disconnect between what they've borrowed and what they can afford to repay. Okay? So in closing, I just want to share a couple of strategies with you. And Mary and I have been through this ourselves. Some of this is based on what we've learned through the years, both as financial aid professionals, but also as parents. So we are really big fans of what we call the piecemeal approach. So the idea is you have a pie and you want to have as many pieces in your pie as possible. If it's pie at Thanksgiving and it's pumpkin pie and you only want to have two pieces because you want a honking piece of pie, that's a good thing. When it comes to higher ed, you don't want to only have two sources of funding. And you don't especially want that to be the case if one of those sources are all loans. Instead, you want to have multiple pieces. So you want to have, hopefully some merit-based aid if the school offers that, some need-based financial aid, the grants, the work study, the federal student loans, scholarships we talked about, bringing in some of those, student savings, including summer or possible school year earnings. When we're looking at this piecemeal approach, the idea is no one piece needs to be huge. So even a sliver of savings is going to start making a difference, which is why we talk about thinking about savings starting as early as possible, but also understanding that it's never too late because even a small amount can make a big difference when you put everything all together. Family savings, obviously incredibly important. I just wanted to mention that here in Maine, we do have a great 529 program, Next Gen. As has been mentioned today, there are matching grants available. So that might be an option of one way that families may choose to save and not only invest their own money, but get some of these additional matching grants. Another thing to think about when it comes to family savings, whether it's through a 529 or something similar, we're coming up on the holidays. It's great if family members, maybe they want to give a gift to open, but give the gift of college or higher ed like we talk about and make a contribution on holidays or birthdays to students' college savings plans. Over the years, that can really start to add up. Another way in which families can pay for higher ed is by using a tuition payment plan, which is where families make a monthly payment. Now, what we want families to do is to think about this years in advance. Like when students are starting high school, if families can start to say, okay, in 4 years, I'm going to have a college student. Can I make my family budget work so that I have some extra money in that budget so that I can do a tuition payment plan? So maybe I can get my car paid off. Maybe I've got some credit card debt that I'm going to try to work to get paid off so that I free up money in my family budget that I can then use for a tuition payment plan, which just allows me to spread my payments out throughout the year. Tuition payment plans are not loans, so there's no interest charged, usually just a small enrollment fee. Many families, unfortunately, do look to other types of borrowing. We have information on our website if that is necessary. I'd love to have families never have to borrow beyond their federal student loans, but we know sometimes that is another piece of the pie for some families. And then one last piece of the pie, at least for today's example, are tax credits. So families who pay tuition fees out of pocket or through college savings plans find the next year when they file their taxes, they may be eligible for a tax credit. They get a tax credit, that means they pay less in taxes. Their assessed tax payment is less than it would have been otherwise. Now, in years when I had my kids in college, I would try. I'm not going to say I did it every year, but I would try to figure out the difference between, okay, here's what we would have paid in taxes if we didn't have the tax credit. Here's what we paid when we did, and take that difference, set it aside, and then use it for the next fall tuition payment. So all of these things in combination, you can see how the more you have, the easier it becomes to pay for higher education. So last resource, and I will put this in the email next week, is to not only think about the piecemeal approach, but consider this path that we've developed that we think can be really helpful. So that path being this 5-step path is early on that savings that we've talked about, whether it be next gen or through what other source. To try to get financially fit, to try to get into a place where, just like when we had to pay for childcare, how did we make that work? Can we think about it the same way when we're trying to pay for higher education? What can we do out of pocket that doesn't have to be repaid for years to come? One of the most important things, I think, is having the chat. I had this chat with my kiddo. He used to go with me a lot to financial aid nights. And so we drive in the car and we talk about these things. But us being on the same page was critical. I'll be honest with you, what our plan was is I was okay if he had to borrow federal student loans, but we weren't going to go beyond that. We knew that going into this process. He knew how much we could afford. He knew what our expectations were of him. So often that conversation hasn't taken place, and the sooner it takes place and the more families are on the same page, the easier it is going to be to navigate this process. So on the back of this document, we have a whole bunch of conversation starters that we'd love to have families talk about. And then last but not least, it's building, once we get to junior and senior year, it's building that list of schools, having a variety of really good options academically, socially, location, size, but also affordability. And then comparing those offers when they do come in. We've talked about averages. You want to get your actuals and then see what that looks like. So we think if people do this, it will make it a little bit easier. It's never easy, but a little bit easier to afford higher education. We have a bunch of resources that I'm not going to go through because we're short on time, but you will get these in your presentation, kind of a little bit about what's on our website. Enrich is a fabulous tool that is free and available to everyone to help you with your financial wellness. Again, savings information, including Next Gen. We'd love to have you check that out. Next month, on January 3rd, we're going to have Understanding Multiple Pathways to Training and Education. We know that there are many options. Every student going to a 4-year school is not what is best for everybody, right? So we need some people to do that, but there are also many other great options, and finding those right options for each individual student is key. And so we will be talking about that next month. That is what I had. Mary, thoughts, additions?
Nothing to add. That was wonderful, amazing, and comprehensive as always. There are no questions in the Q&A either. So I think we've addressed those, but certainly if folks have questions after the fact, they can reach out anytime. So that was wonderful, Mila. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. I'm gonna stop the recording, but hold tight for just a second.